Hello and welcome to a quick look at the new map Giant Shadow in the new spectator mode. So this spectator mode has a lot more options than the spectator mode in Battlefield 4. Now I'm not going to go through all the options in spectator mode, but for this video I've basically turned off every icon that could appear on the map, and I've also slowed the camera down. So let's go through the capture points on this new map. For this look through the map, we're going to be starting at the German spawn, which is A, and going to be moving through towards F, which is near the British spawn. As you can see from the map, it is fairly linear. It's a narrow, long map. The only 2 points that are really combined together are C and D, and those are inside the airship. But we'll see those later. Let's start with A. So here we're moving from the British spawn towards A, and it's rolling hills and trees and a windmill. At A there are quite a few buildings. It's basically a small village based around one street. There's wood piles. There's a lot of high walls in this village that you can vault over. Spectator mode doesn't make it so obvious how these buildings and walls affect line of sight. But here you can see I'm on the ground at the A flag, and there's pretty much a very limited line of sight from this flag because it's surrounded by walls and buildings. Now most of the buildings are actually towards the map itself, so towards the B flag rather than towards the spawn. This part of the map will be pretty familiar if you've played the single player, because this is the area where you've got to sneak around and try and get the spark plugs for your engine. The layout seems to be exactly the same for this multiplayer. The only difference is that there are vehicle spawns kicking around here and there's no engines or tanks. So this isn't a straight copy of the single player map. It is a map that has been designed for multiplayer, and some of that single player detail has been removed and some extra multiplayer things have been added. Because A flag has a standard capture radius, it means that most of this area is outside the A flag capture radius, so all of these buildings are basically cover to move up to A or to move from A to B. And you are going to need that cover because the B flag really doesn't have an awful lot of cover on its own. It's a flag with a few buildings around it, all of which can be completely levelled. The 2-storey building, or is it 3-storey building on the left, is a bit harder to destroy, but the other two usually end up completely flat. You can see how sparse it is from the on the foot view. Basically there are a barn, there's a very small building, and there's the large building. Now you do get a jeep and a motorbike, and there is an AA gun here. Other than that, this is basically just a few station buildings, and this is the railway track that the armoured train comes down. And it's interesting to note that the armoured train doesn't go to a balanced set of capture points. So from B here, the armoured train can run to C, which is inside the crashed airship. But after this point, it runs on to F, which we'll look at later. So these crashed airship points are pretty much the same, so C and D are pretty much identical. They're both inside the crashed airship, so they're surrounded by girders which block off some paths. Then you've got the fabric which blocks out the view, and inside it's pretty much just rubble and these fuel tanks, but they do quite a good job of blocking off the view. So it's not an open shooting range in here. There are places to get out of view, and it is quite an interesting place to run and gun. Unfortunately, some of the terrain is a bit dodgy. It's the kind of stuff that stops you running or stops you moving and that you can't quite jump over. But it's a really good area for fighting, and this is where you're going to get most of your ground troop fighting. Moving out of the airship, we go towards the E flag. Now E flag, like B, is quite a small flag with a few limited buildings and some wood piles, and it is quite open. There's not an awful lot you can say about B even from the ground. The only interesting thing about this map and E is the fact that the train doesn't come to E. So unlike B, which is his counterpart on the other side of the map, there is no train line here. The train goes through to F. F is the train yard, which you will also have seen in the multiplayer, and it's a massive area with a lot of rail cars, a lot of train tracks and buildings. Unfortunately, a bit like A, because it's the outer flag, it very often doesn't get used. Most of the fighting tends to happen around C and D, and it's only if one team is really getting pushed back, or if one team has flanked around and is trying to capture the back points, that A and F really ever get used. Now I know in the smaller game modes these built up areas are going to be used for things like domination and team deathmatch, but in Conquest Large it really does seem a bit of a waste, because this is the kind of fighting area I like and you can't really use it that often. If you're wondering how can he say that when he's obviously fighting at F, well, that's because we've completely steamrolled this team. So the German side holds all the capture points and the British are basically pinned back to their spawn and F. Okay, so let's talk about vehicles on this map. It is a tank heavy map. Now I did forget to check this, but I think there's either 3 or 2 tanks that spawn at the actual team spawn. F certainly has 2 tanks that spawn at it, and I think that A has 2 tanks as well, although it may well be B, I'm not quite sure. But there are a lot of tanks that roam around on this map. There are an awful lot of motorbikes and there are an awful lot of jeeps, so getting around on vehicles on this map is pretty important. There is a lot of open ground in between the flags, and 2 of the flags, B and E, are pretty open as well, so tanks can go and capture those points. You can actually drive tanks into the airship, but I wouldn't recommend it. But B and E are basically tank capture points because there's very few buildings there and those are soon flattened. Now the armoured train, like I say, is pretty interesting because you can see it here at F, which is the closest flag to the British spawn, and it's the flag that's got the heavily built up areas. Whereas if the train comes from the German side, the first flag it gets to is B, which isn't its first flag, it's its second flag, and it's not built up at all. Then the train runs through to C, and C is a lot closer to B than it is to F. So I'm not quite sure what the thought was with the armoured train. I think it gives a distinct advantage to the Germans, but I could be completely wrong. But it didn't seem to do the British a lot of good on this map. Right, so that's my look at the new Giant Shadow map. I know for some of you, you're not going to be able to play it until the 20th, so this should give you an idea of what to expect. Unfortunately, it's not a World War I map that I kind of wanted. It's very similar to maps we already have. Seriously, DICE, when are we going to get a trench map in World War I? Now, I'm not saying this map is bad. It's just not great. It's not going to be a memorable map of Battlefield 1. It's just going to be another map. But it's free. Everybody's going to get it, so we can't really complain.